Okay, welcome to Chapter 5. Again, this is continuing our series of lectures. We're in the discussion of the police, or law enforcement more properly, if we use kind of a more generic and perhaps in some ways, ironically, a more exact term than simply saying the police. So we're going to look at some problems and some solutions in modern policing. And we'll just jump right in now. And again, this lecture should last about 40 minutes or so, maybe an hour. Excuse me. Okay, the first idea that you have to grasp when you're talking about modern policing is that police organizations are in fact bureaucracies. They exist specifically in a format, a hierarchical format, which means really a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid is the leadership, which in the classic police department is going to be the chief of police. In a rural department like Wake County, it would be the sheriff. But it could be, if you have the FBI, the director of the FBI. So it's basically a top-down structure. And there are formal rules in existence. These are usually published. So almost all police departments have manuals of behavior, police policies. And the goal, at least the stated goal from your text, is to achieve the maximum efficiency, remembering that there is always a limited amount of resources to accomplish any task, particularly any governmental task. So they have to allocate the staff, that is the people that work for the department, typically we just refer to them as police officers, and the budget, how much to spend and what to spend it on, how much you're going to spend on salary, how much you're going to spend on equipment, how much you're going to spend on outreach programs. Okay, clearly the organization itself is influenced internally by things like who's actually running it, who is composed of it, but also externally. So one of the questions, or one of the ways you study police departments, is you look at the jurisdictional size. So let's take a practical example for the local area. Wake County Sheriff's Department has a jurisdiction or authority for the entire county of Wake County. So it goes all the way up past Creedmoor and all the way down towards Johnston County and over towards Durham County. And what you've got is you've got a very large geographical area, which is going to mandate that the structure of the department, plus you've got different delegations of powers. So the Wake County Sheriff's Department, as an example, is in charge of providing security for the Wake County Courthouse, Wake County system. So the Wake County Sheriff will divide his officers into those that might patrol the county in a rural way, and those that would be in downtown Raleigh handling the jails and the courtroom security. Jurisdictions can also be influenced by types of crime. Some organizations, for example, the Internal Revenue Service has a law enforcement component. They're going to be charged with investigating things like tax fraud. So they are going to be structured differently than an organization like, say, the Chicago Police Department, which has got a multitude of crimes they'll investigate, fraud probably not being one of the larger components for Chicago. We also need to look at the demographics of the population. Demographics, demos, it means people. Graphics is going to really be the discussion or the grouping of these people. So if you have populations that are very dispersed, like in a rural county, or very concentrated, again, it kind of goes back to jurisdiction, and that'll affect the structure of the department. Racial components will affect it. Linguistic components can affect it. All these things have an impact. Now, there is a chain of command, and we have a clear rank structure from the top to the bottom, so it is paramilitary in its structure. So we tend to assign ranks in police departments, much like the military. So in many police departments, you have a private, the analogous private in the military, and sometimes they're called officers. Then you might have a rank of a corporal. It's a two-stripe rank. and sometimes they get called something like master officer. Almost all police departments have retained the non-commissioned officer rank of sergeant, so you will see those, for example, in the Raleigh Police Department. Moving up from there, now there can be a little bit more of a split. Typically in the American military, the rank above sergeant is lieutenant, then captain, then major, and you certainly will see those inside police departments. But you also can have organizational titles like detective, chief detective, and it's pretty much left up to the department where they want to put them in the hierarchy, but quite definitely there are people above and below. Law enforcement officers in the field, really we look at three main components. Patrol officers, which at least from the public's general perception is the largest thing that the police do. They drive, looking around for crime or responding. Investigations, officers that will go in and look at reported crimes or look at potential reported crimes. And then special operation units like the famous SWAT teams. Patrol is, of course, the backbone of most modern police departments, and every department will have some type of patrol unit. And usually, because it's what both the public expects and what is seen as the traditional job of policing, it is the largest of the departments. And the goal of the patrol unit is to deter crime by maintaining a visible presence. And this is the idea, whether this is true or not, we could discuss, that the presence of police officers, the more police officers you have, the lower the crime rate. Now, in fact, if you get a moment, you want to check out the micro lecture on the Kansas City experiment. In fact, it is probably not as true as we would like to believe that patrolling actually lowers crime rates. The second thing, the purpose of patrol, though, is to provide, and this is very important, a sense of security. The public, after all, is the ultimate source of both support, financially, ethically, morally, socially, politically, of a police department. So by providing them with a sense of security, that bolsters the police in the minds of the people who are both being served by the police and who are paying for the police. Finally, there is services that are not directly crime related. So, for example, if someone had a heart attack, it's very possible that the police would be the first responders and they might call EMS, or they might try to determine if it is or is not a crime that was occurred. They might be called to a public disturbance. Interestingly enough, about 7 to 10% of the police contacts are with individuals, this is on patrol, who have some form of mental illness or are dealing with some form of mental illness, and this might be something as dangerous as a psychotic break with someone who is displaying acts of paranoid schizophrenia or violence, or it might be something as mild as severe depression or a suicide attempt, not that that's mild, but all of those could be potentially something that happens with the police constantly. Okay, if we look at patrol activities, about 40% of the time they are simply on preventive patrol. That is, they are driving around. About 25% of the time they are responding to a call for service. And about 20% of the time they're doing administrative work, paperwork, because there is paperwork associated with every bureaucratic behavior. And then sometimes the officers themselves are initiating an action with citizens, and this can be something as direct as a stop and frisk, or it could be something to improve community relations, so it might be stopping and saying hello, or it might be visiting a shut-in in the area, or checking on someone after getting a report that there hasn't been a lot of activity or there's been suspicious activity someplace. All right, the second major function is investigative, and this is very much reactive, because before you can have an investigation, you have to have two things: the occurrence of a crime or potential crime, and then the detection of that crime. So a police officer, the patrol officer, is very often the one who initiates this because he might discover the crime. A serious enough crime, though, we usually call for a detective, which is a higher rank in the hierarchy, to investigate the crimes. And typically investigators are called detectives, and they are promoted internally in the ranks from patrol officer. It is not as glamorous as you see it in the media, so it's not something that is as exciting as you see on the big screen movies or TV shows. They do spend a tremendous amount of their time investigating not violent crimes, certainly not homicides or horrific crimes like rape or assault with deadly weapons. They spend most of their time investigating property crimes, so burglaries, shopliftings, larcenies, robberies, all of those are investigated by the police, and because they're far more common than the person-on-person crime, that is what the police have been directed to deal with most of the time. We do see some undercover operations. Again, these are probably not as common as you would see on TV. You do have to use them probably most often when you're dealing with organized crime. So organized crime as opposed to a random occurrence crime or a crime with just a single individual is involved. They can be very dangerous for the police officers. They can be somewhat controversial depending upon questions like entrapment. And very often what the police will use for undercover operations is not necessarily a police officer, but someone who is inside whatever agency or organization, such as the mafia or a street gang, who is informing on that gang to the police. And we call those confidential informants. And this is used sometimes when an officer can infiltrate for different reasons. Maybe if we're talking about an ethnic gang or group and the police department has no one of that ethnic nature or no one that's capable of doing the infiltration, so they might have to recruit a confidential informant. Or they don't want to risk an officer in a dangerous situation. So those can be reasons why they use others. Okay. The goal of law enforcement, at least stated in your book, is to clear cases, which means crime gets reported, crime gets investigated, an arrest is made, and a prosecution is made. Doesn't mean a conviction is made, by the way. Now, if we go back a few years, and these statistics are a tad old, we're going to look at the 2012 here, for example. About half, 47% of violent crimes are solved. And about 20%, only about 1 in 5, of property crimes are solved. And in part that even though we devote more resources overall to property crime, as a percentage of occurrence of crime, we're going to devote a lot more resources to violent crimes. Of course, we do see lower clearance rates after a crime has occurred. So what we mean by that is sometimes you hear the term the golden 48. Very often crime is investigated, and if the crime cannot easily be solved, or if determination the crime has occurred, or who's the natural suspects can't be made early on within, let's say, 48 hours, then the probability of solving that crime drops dramatically. And part of the reason for that is, again, unlike the media and TV, investigations very often focus on probability. So if an individual, let's take a heinous crime like murder occurs, you don't go out, as in movies or TV shows, looking for serial killers or some sort of bizarre scenario. You can focus on who probably killed them statistically to give you leads for your investigation, and that would be things like a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend, a close acquaintance. All of those would have higher probabilities that they were at least involved in the crime or knew something, so you could focus on them. When you come across a homicide then, where the individual is not killed by someone they know, or is not killed by an acquaintance, or is not killed in a work-related environment, let's suppose they're killed by a serial killer, those types of investigations become much more difficult because you don't have this kind of head start, the result of which is the clearance rates are going to be lower for those. Officers also rely upon forensics, which is simply evidence, to solve cases. So some of the things that can be very important is, what's the cause of death? A police officer comes across a body in the street. One of the determinations has to be, is this a homicide? Is it a natural death? So this can be done. The cause of death can be determined by, again, it depends on jurisdiction, medical examiner, or it might be determined, it could be determined simply by observation. If someone has, 3 bullet holes in their chest, it's a pretty good idea that, and they're dead, it's a pretty good guess that they were killed by a firearm. Second thing that can be of importance is the time of death. So again, if you can determine approximately when a crime occurred, this can lead you to probabilities who might have committed the crime. If you suspect a crime was occurred at, say, 9 in the morning, but one of your suspects was in police custody at that point for another crime, well, then your time of death won't work out. Type of weapon used, certainly study of ballistics or other forensic pathologies might determine, was a firearm used, was a rope used, was a stabbing used. Identity of crime victims can be very important, particularly if you find victims a long time afterwards, so skeletal reconstruction. And of course, the ultimate one is the identity of the offender. And we can be looking at things like, okay, if there was a stabbing, maybe the victim of the stabbing also stabbed the person who attacked him, then you might be able, through forensics, to determine by taking a blood sample of the other party who actually committed the crime. So crime scene forensics, it's very important to secure and protect trace evidence from contamination. Now, trace evidence are things that are left at the scene of the crime. And classically, these can be things like fingerprints, which are really just kind of oily residue that is left from contact, or blood, we don't know what blood is, or even hair. Ballistics is the study of firearms. I mentioned that just briefly before, including how a weapon is fired, the flight of the bullet. So, one of the big determining characteristics is, are we talking about a rifled projectile, usually a pistol or a rifle, in which case you're going to have what you could call a solid bullet, or are you talking about something like a shotgun? And the difference between those two is that a solid bullet fired from a classic pistol or classic rifle, much easier to trace back to a specific rifle or a specific pistol. On the other hand, a shotgun, very difficult, because you might have some of the casings and that might give you a strike mark, but you're not going to be able to recover a single bullet and say, okay, it came out of this shotgun. In the mid-90s, DNA, which it really wasn't discovered until the 1960s, becomes an important tool of law enforcement. And very quickly we were able to identify people if we can find a match between their DNA and others. Even identical twins, and this is the same fingerprints, don't have the same DNA. So it can be very closely related, don't get me wrong. It's closely related between brothers and sisters, but twins don't have identical DNA. One of the things that we know is that if you have a match of DNA, the probability of that match being incorrect, assuming that everything was done right and the sampling was correct, can be 30 billion to 1, which usually means if there's not even 30 billion people on the planet, there's no other person on the planet that matches something. So one of the nice things about DNA is it can really help you if you have one of these crimes that you can't solve by looking at what the high probability occurrence is. So if you have, again, we'll go back to a serial killer because it's something that people are familiar with. If you have a serial killer, one of the nice things, or a serial rapist, is that if you have a sample of the killer or the rapist's DNA, maybe you have semen or blood, then you can look at large databases and you can do searches in those databases. It might be something like Ancestry.com. It might be something like the military records, because every military serviceman now has a DNA sample. It might be something like general criminal records, because most police departments now take DNA samples of people they arrest. Okay, calls for service. Very often, how we judge the police, and calls for service is basically when the police get a call and they respond to it. is we judge them, when did they get a call and how fast did they get there? And this is called response time. And it's one of the ways that police departments are measured. And we say, well, this police department A, is efficient because the time between the call for assistance and the arrival of the police was, say, 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And that's police department A. Police department B is not efficient because the time between call is 30 minutes or 40 minutes, a very long period of time. Now, unfortunately, it's a pretty poor way to measure police departments overall, because almost all of the time the crime has already occurred. It's not an ongoing situation. So response time is not as critical as you might think. This has led to introduction of the 311 non-emergency call system and the idea that we will grade calls depending upon how serious they are. If you have an ongoing crisis, like a hostage crisis or a bank robbery, that's going to go to the top, and that should be responded to as quickly as possible. Conversely, other systems, not so much. Other events, not as important. If you discover a burglary that occurred a week ago, a couple gets home from vacation, their house was broken into, it's nice if the police get there rapidly. The people might feel better, but in fact, it's not going to necessarily help solve the crime, and it's really not a demonstration of efficiency, and it might be better for the police to respond to an ongoing burglary or assault. Okay, strategies that work, we can look at random patrol. This is certainly something that the police do, where they monitor areas by driving through. I will refer you to the micro lecture that is posted about testing this. We did several experiments, primarily in Kansas City, about preventive patrol. And I think the important part of preventive patrol is not that it's useless, but that what it does is it reassures the community. And people base their decisions not necessarily on what they know, but what they feel. We also have directed patrol, and this is focusing on specific types of activity. So if you had a series of rapes in an area or a series of assaults in an area or vandalism, you might direct patrol, and it might, be dedicated or tasks with interrupting or preventing those crimes. One of the things that computers, and we have a CompStat system now, one of the things that has happened is we've been able to apply computer data, very complex algorithms, to look at how crime occurs, and this has allowed us to map crime. We always knew crime occurred in certain areas and it might be more common, but we've really gotten very good at determining things like time of day of the commission of crimes, probable location, and this allows us to allocate and respond much more efficiently. So very important. We also can make decisions about arrest strategies. Reactive arrests are those made by the police who observe a criminal act and respond to call. Proactive is when they take the initiative. One of the things that the police have to make a decision is it always worthwhile to make an arrest? If a police officer is trying to maintain good relations with the community, is trying to overcome, say, a history of racial bias that a police department is held up by a minority community, or ethnic bias, then arresting multiple people for jaywalking is probably not a great idea. Conversely, sometimes the police will devote energy to low-level crimes, and this is what's called the broken window theory. You attack low-level crimes so that they don't grow into a pattern of high-level crimes. An example here would be the police see a house that has some structural problems or maybe some broken windows, and they go and they say, you need to fix that or we're going to write you a ticket. And if they hadn't, then maybe 3 months later the house gets run down, and 6 months later it gets abandoned, and a year later it becomes a crack house. So by dealing with quality of life issues very quickly, then you can try to prevent the disintegration of a neighborhood, or you can reverse the disintegration of a neighborhood. Community policing is the philosophy that emphasizes community support for and cooperation with the police. The police are only as effective as their support inside the community. If the police don't have the trust and the support of the community, they usually have lower solve rates, lower ability to handle crimes. So you want a partnership with the community. You want them to be engaged. One of the things you want them to do is cooperate with you. Like, okay, when you go and you ask people, did you see who committed this crime? You want honest answers. You don't want people saying, well, I don't trust the police. And you know, one of the areas we're seeing this played out, and this is not as obvious as might think about, is in how do you deal with potential legal and illegal immigrants. If the police have been tasked with enforcing crime in an area, and there are a number of illegal aliens in that area, and if those illegal aliens could cooperate with the police and help solve heinous crimes like a murder or a rape, but they know that if they come in contact with the police or if they cooperate with the police that they're likely to be deported, then those crimes might be undetected. And in fact, criminals might know this. They might say, well, we'll just prey on people that are here illegally or have family members that are here illegally. And then we'll know they won't report us to the police. But if the police aren't tasked with immigration enforcement, then those police officers might have a good enough relationship with that community to do investigations, and that community might say, well, yeah, we're investigating a crime of murder or rape or arson. We don't have to worry about these cops turning us in. That's going to be ICE. So this cooperation, particularly this building up of goodwill, can be very important. Problem-oriented policing is you identify criminal activity and develop strategies to prevent or respond to it. And what you're really trying to do is get to the root cause of criminal behavior and not just look at a reactive system. Not just, I'm going to wait for a crime to occur and then I'm going to deal with it. It's going to be, why is this crime occurring? How can I prevent it from occurring? Remember, the most efficient and effective police department is not the one that catches the bad guys. That's great, that's needed, but the most efficient and effective police department is the one that prevents the crime in the first place. If your wallet is stolen, it's great if the police catch the guy that stole it. But the odds of the money being in the wallet after that are pretty low. What's better for you is your wallet doesn't get stolen. So problem-oriented policing would look to things like, how do we prevent these types of crimes? All right, let's talk a little bit about the police subculture, sometimes addressed as the thin blue line. The police, through a process, are transformed from civilians into police officers. And whenever someone acquires value, we call this socialization. And this process has both formal and informal components. Inside this police subculture, police officers see themselves as separate and apart from the general public. They see their job as dangerous, they see it as stressful, sometimes boring, sometimes violent. How does this subculture or socialization occur? Well, you've got the formal part. You attend the police academy. Of course, before that there is one step. You have to decide to attend it. So it is a self-selecting process. Then you go through the formal beginnings of socialization, the police academy. Then you're going to work with your FTO, your field training officer. This is going to be a senior officer who's going to bring you in, put you on the streets, work with you. You're going to make your initial felony arrest. You would use force for a first time. You might use or witness deadly force being used. You might witness the first major traumatic event or incident. Very often, police officers, as they go through this, begin to identify with each other and not with the general public. And this can be both good and bad. It builds cohesive units, it builds comradeship. Those are both very positive things. But it can separate the police from the general public. And we have the development of the blue curtain, what's called in your book, or the thin blue line, which is why sometimes, police officers are seen as not cooperating or distrustful of the outsiders. They very much believe they know what is to be done, and they indeed might be right, not to discount that. Continuing with this kind of us versus them thin blue line. Police come in contact with about 40 million people every year. Most of this is not dangerous. So police officers do not have particularly high death rates or injury rates at work. But it can be a very stressful work. So we do see higher rates of burnout, which is kind of a precursor to PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disease or syndrome. And police officers do show higher rates of stress-induced illnesses, such as heart attacks. They show higher rates of divorce. They can show higher rates of things like alcoholism. So, it is a stressful job. Use of force is actually pretty rare. It only occurs in about 1.5% of police-to-public encounters. And we can look at a matrix or a mix of this force, going all the way from simply the physical presence of the officer to asserting the authority, might be a voice command, to stepping up from that, physically restraining someone, to deadly force. And there's all the gradations in between. The degree of force that you use has to be reasonable. So a police officer is allowed to use force, unlike most of the general public, when it's reasonable to protect himself or other citizens or property, but it cannot be excessive. And if he is going to use deadly force, if he is going to take the life of a civilian, and anytime a firearm is pulled and anytime someone's shot, that's deadly force. But also if a police officer, can physically restrain people in certain circumstances, that can get to the level of deadly force. There's been cases of certain chokeholds and things. But deadly force is force applied by the police officer that is likely or intended to cause death. Anytime a firearm is used, we're talking deadly force. The authority to use deadly force really goes to two critical cases, and if you take a constitutional law class here at Wake Tech, we'll go over each of these. So we'll look at Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. Quickly, basically the Supreme Court of the United States said police officers can't use deadly force to stop just any felony, because there are some felonies that are nonviolent. They only use deadly force if their own life or if another's life is in danger, or if you've got a violent felon. Those are really going to be the limitations. All right, let's talk about ethics. One of the things is that courts generally err on the side of police officers. And part of this is police officers can be placed in difficult situations where they have to make immediate decisions. And for a court to go back and with perfect knowledge say, well, that decision was wrong, there was a better decision, that's just deemed not to be either good policing or fair. So we generally will consider the police trustworthy. We give them the benefit of the doubt. And we generally believe that police officers who have the experience and the training are better able to make determination of what is and is not a reasonable action than the courts later. So we assume that police officers, because of their job, are knowledgeable about humans and behaviors, and that we have to let the police protect themselves and protect others. Sadly, of course, there is police corruption. And this, again, is usually a range of behavior, all the way from very minor things like taking a free cup of coffee to soliciting things like taking bribes. It can even go to the level of committing acts of violence. So how do we police the police? The famous expression is quaes custodias custodias, which is Latin meaning who shall guard the guards. Well, traditionally we use internal units. We let the police supervise themselves. Sometimes they're called internal affairs units. There's been some criticism of this because, again, the police are an insular group, and the feeling, among some at least, is that we shouldn't trust people to watch themselves. There should be citizen oversight, for example. Let's have citizens review complaints that come into police officers from rude departments to make sure everything's doing well. That tussle's been going on quite a while. One of the things that's kind of changed the game here is body cameras. Whereas previously, it was very often the word of a citizen or someone who was being arrested, sometimes a felon or a bad person, his word against the police. Now we have physical evidence. And this has changed how many of the public and how many people perceive what's going on. And there's been a greater attempt to hold police officers accountable and to make these body cameras and this surveillance more readily available and reviewable by the public. So we can look at things like external punishments. Again, we had a course in Wake Tech called Civil Liability for Police Officers. Certainly police officers can be sued civilly. They can either be sued federally under what's called the Civil Rights Act, it's called Section 1983. They theoretically, although it's very rarely done, can be prosecuted criminally. Those external options exist. One of the things that complicates this mixture is race and ethnicity. Police officers often have to deal with the problems in a very real sense that society talks about theoretically. So there's no question that there is a racial and ethnic divide in the United States. And in this divide, the police officers represent a barrier, and the minorities can feel over-policed. They can feel that the police are biased against them. Sometimes it's the presence of the police themselves. Sometimes it's the composition of the police. Sometimes the police are seen as engaging in activities that minority communities or racial ethnic communities don't feel are appropriate, and this might constitute a civil rights violation. And this, particularly in the past, there's clear evidence of this. You can go back and you can look at how police departments in both the North, the South, the West behaved during segregation. And you saw clear civil rights violations. When the police do this, frequently this can lead to Department of Justice investigations, and police do not have immunity from these investigations, and these can be pretty serious. There are some dilemmas. One of the things you learn when you become an adult is that you don't always know what the right thing to do is. And sometimes you have what's called a Hobson's choice. Hobson's choice means that there's no good option. And sometimes, of course, the wrong answer is very tempting. The wrong answer solves things quickly. And maybe it's what superiors want you to do. One of the reasons that we venerate or admire people who are moral is that morality isn't always easy. If we look at some of these dilemmas, when should discretion be exercised? When should the police let someone off or not let someone off? What duty do the police have morally and legally? How honest should be the police? And you might say, well, they have to be 100% honest. Really? Let's suppose they come across someone who died, and then the family asks for details of the death, and there's graphic or gruesome details. A police officer could say something like, he died very quickly, or it was a painless death, when in fact it wasn't. But he might be doing that to assuage the grieving family. And of course, they have to have loyalty to each other if they're going to do their jobs. So these discretion, duty, honesty, all can conflict with one another and create dilemmas in the society. Okay, well, that's about a 40-minute lecture. We're going to be moving on. We're still talking about the police, but hope you tune in for the next one.